I walked out of my own daughter's wedding before they cut the cake, and what happened in the parking lot of that golf club changed everything I thought I understood about my father. My dad's name is Bert, not Robert, not Herbert, just Bert, like the name on his Ontario health card, like the name stitched on the work jacket he wore every day for 32 years at the sheet metal shop in Sudbury. He is 67 years old, he has calluses on both hands, and he drives a 2009 Ford F-150 with a crack in the passenger side mirror that he fixed with electrical tape sometime around 2019 and never replaced. He is the most decent person I have ever known. I should have remembered that before the night of October 14th. My name is Leonard. I am 51 years old. I run a mid-sized commercial flooring company out of Barrie, Ontario. The kind of business that isn't glamorous, but keeps a crew of 11 people employed year-round and puts enough aside that my wife and I don't lose sleep about the mortgage. My daughter, Claire, is 28. She got her mother's good looks and my stubbornness, which is not always a flattering combination, but I was proud of her. Still am. This story isn't about Claire. It's about what her in-laws said to my father at her rehearsal dinner, and what my father said back, 4 weeks later, in the parking lot of Northview Golf and Country Club on a Friday night in October. Claire met her husband, James, 3 years ago at a marketing firm in Toronto, where they both worked. He's a decent enough young man. Quiet. Agreeable in the way that sometimes makes you wonder if he actually has opinions or just mirrors whoever he's talking to. But he made Claire happy, and he treated her with respect, so I kept my reservations to myself, the way fathers learn to do when their daughters are grown. His family is a different matter. James's parents, his father and his mother, I will call them what Claire called them, because using their actual first names still leaves a sour feeling in my mouth. His father is a real estate developer in Oakville. His mother chairs 3 different charity boards and has opinions about wine pairings that she shares without being asked. They live in a house that looks like it was designed to appear in a magazine, the kind of house where you feel like you need to wipe your feet twice and still apologize. Every surface is deliberate. Every object has a purpose beyond its function. The first time I visited, I sat down on a chair in their living room, and his mother said, very pleasantly, "Oh, careful with that. It's from a dealer in Montreal." I nodded and said nothing and spent the rest of the visit sitting slightly forward, not entirely touching the chair. My father came with us that day. He sat in the back of our SUV and wore the same blazer he'd worn to my university graduation, the dark green one that still fit him well enough. He brought a bottle of Ontario rye whiskey from a distillery near Huntsville that he'd been told was excellent. He held it in his lap the whole drive down and said he hoped they'd like it. They were polite to him, the way people are polite to someone they have already categorized. His mother thanked him for the whiskey and set it on a side table in the hallway. I never saw it come back out. Over the following months, as the wedding plans took shape, I noticed things, small things that individually meant nothing, but together formed a picture I should have looked at more carefully. When the seating chart came up, Claire mentioned, somewhat awkwardly, that James's parents had suggested my dad might be more comfortable at a table near the back. Closer to the kitchen, she said, because it would be quieter and he was older. My father, when Claire told him, just nodded and said that sounded fine. I told Claire to put him wherever she wanted. She put him at a table near the back. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private room in a restaurant in Oakville, the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't list prices. His parents hosted it, which I understood was tradition, and I was grateful enough for the gesture that I arrived in a good mood and told my wife, Donna, I should say, my wife's name is Donna. She has been my partner for 31 years and the steadiest person in any room she enters. I told her on the drive down that we were going to be gracious and let the evening be about the kids. We were gracious. For about 2 hours. My father arrived in a taxi because his truck had been making a noise he didn't trust on the highway. He walked in wearing his green blazer and a tie that he'd bought specifically for the occasion. A burgundy one that I recognized as new because the tag was still faintly visible at the back of his collar. He had shaved. He had combed his hair. He looked to me like exactly what he was. A man who had worked hard his whole life and was doing his best to show up properly for his granddaughter's wedding. James's father's brother was at the dinner. A man in his mid-50s, the kind of man who mistakes confidence for authority and volume for intelligence. He'd had 2 drinks before dinner was served. By the time the appetizers arrived, he was holding court at the far end of the table, talking about a development project in Mississauga that had returned 38%. My father was sitting quietly, eating his soup. He'd been speaking with one of Claire's cousins earlier in the evening, talking about fishing up near Killarney, and he'd seemed comfortable and easy in that conversation. That's my dad. Give him a person who's actually interested in talking, and he'll give you an hour of quiet, patient stories that you'll still be thinking about a week later. He wasn't aware of what was happening until it happened. James's uncle was telling a story about a charity gala in Toronto, something involving an auction and a bidding war. And somehow, the way these things happen when certain kinds of men have had 2 drinks and an audience, it became a story about people who didn't belong, about the wrong sort showing up in the right places. He was smiling the whole time. He thought he was being funny. He gestured down the table, not at my father directly but in his direction, and said something to the man beside him. I didn't catch it, but the woman across from my father did, because she looked down at her plate immediately. And my father did, because he stopped eating. I leaned toward my wife and said quietly, "What did he say?" She said, just as quietly, "He said, 'Who brought the handyman?'" The table didn't go silent. That would have been cleaner. Instead, it just continued, the conversation rolling on like nothing had happened, because enough people either hadn't heard or had decided not to react. James looked at his appetizer. Claire, to her credit, went pale. James's mother took a sip of her wine. My father put his spoon down and looked at his soup. I started to stand up. My wife put her hand on my arm. My father looked up then, and for a moment our eyes met across the table, and he gave me the smallest shake of his head. Not angry, not hurt, or at least not visibly. Just, no, let it go. I sat back down. I should not have. That is the thing I come back to now, late at night sometimes when I can't sleep. Not what was said, not even what happened later. Just that moment where I looked at my father's face and chose to follow his lead instead of my own gut, and how the wrong kind of deference can look a lot like respect but isn't. The rest of the rehearsal dinner passed. My father finished his dinner. He said goodnight to Claire and held both her hands in his and told her he was proud of her. He shook James's hand. He called a taxi from the parking lot. I walked out with him and we stood in the October cold and I said, "Dad," and he said, "It's fine, Lenny," which is what he calls me when he wants me to know he means it, even when he doesn't entirely. The wedding was 4 weeks later. Northview Golf and Country Club. 340 guests, which was about 280 more than I'd thought the wedding was going to have when Claire first mentioned getting engaged. But James's parents had a particular idea of what the event should look like, and the guest list had expanded to match that idea. The room was formal and beautiful in the way that rooms are, when a great deal of money has been spent ensuring they look effortless. Round tables with white linens, a head table on a raised platform, a band that would play after dinner, lighting that made everyone look like they were in a film. My father drove himself this time. His truck had been serviced. He parked it in the lot beside a row of European sedans and walked in wearing the green blazer and the burgundy tie, both of which he had dry cleaned. I know he had them dry cleaned because he mentioned it to me on the phone the week before, not to be acknowledged but just as a fact. The way he relays practical information. Dinner was served. The speeches began. James's father gave a speech about legacy and success and the importance of family, which contained a number of references to the Carmichael family name, James's last name, and what it represented in the community. He looked at the room when he said it. He was a man accustomed to rooms looking back. Then the toasts progressed, and somehow, I'm still not entirely clear on how it happened, whether it was spontaneous or planned. James's uncle was on his feet again. He is the kind of man who never needs a microphone because he assumes everyone wants to hear him. He did not have a microphone. He did not need one. 340 people heard him clearly. He raised his glass to the room, said something jovial about marriage and commitment, and then he turned to the table where my father was sitting. And I want to be precise about this, because he did not say it under his breath. He did not mutter it. He said it in a voice designed to travel. And he said, to the man beside him, but loud enough for the table to hear, "Can you believe they let anyone in here?" And then he laughed, and the man beside him laughed. And somewhere in that room, in the silence that followed, I heard my father's chair shift. I stood up. I don't remember making the decision. I don't remember the calculation. I remember being seated, and then I remember being on my feet, and the room was looking at me, and my heart was going very fast, but my voice, when it came, was even. I said, "I'd like to make a toast." People assumed it was planned. A few of them picked up their glasses. The band had stopped playing between sets. The timing was unintentionally perfect, I said. To my daughter Claire, who has always known that the most important thing a person can be is kind. And to my father Bert, who has never once in his 67 years let anyone make him small. I've been watching people underestimate him my entire life. I've never once seen it end well for them. I picked up my glass. I drank. I sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet that happens when something true has been said publicly and everyone is deciding what to do with it. Then someone near the back started clapping, then more people. It wasn't thunderous, it was steady. My father was looking at his table. He didn't look up until the applause had mostly stopped, and when he did, he found me across the room, and he nodded once. James's uncle sat with his glass still raised for a moment, longer than was comfortable, then lowered it. James's mother was smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. My wife was crying quietly beside me, which she would later insist was allergies, and I love her too much to disagree. I thought it was over. I thought the speech had drawn a line, and that was enough. It was not enough. An hour later, during the dancing portion of the evening, James's mother found me near the bar. She was composed the way someone is composed when they've been composing themselves for several minutes, specifically to have a conversation. She said she wanted to discuss my little speech. She said she understood I was emotional. She said these things with the practiced warmth of a woman who chairs charity boards and knows how to frame a dismissal as a concern. She said specifically that my father's presence had been, and she paused here, choosing the word carefully, a bit awkward for the room. I said, awkward how? She said that at an event like this, people had certain expectations, and she was sure I understood that it wasn't personal. It was simply a matter of, and here she paused again, fitting the occasion. I looked at her for a moment. She held my gaze very steadily. I said, my father worked 32 years in a sheet metal shop in Sudbury so that I could build a business and send my daughter to university and get her to a wedding like this. He drove 2.5 hours today in a truck he got serviced specifically for the occasion. He's wearing a blazer he's had for 20 years because it still fits and it still looks good. And I can tell you with complete certainty that he is the most decent, most honest person in this room, right now, which is not a low bar to clear, but he clears it without trying. I paused. If the room is awkward, I said, I'd look closer at your brother-in-law. She said, excuse me? I said, I think you heard me. I walked back to my table. My wife looked at my face and said, very quietly, what happened? I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, good. We stayed for another 40 minutes. Long enough for Claire to have her first dance and for my father to dance, briefly and with great dignity, with my wife to a song I didn't recognize. Then I said goodnight to Claire, who hugged me very tightly and said, into my shoulder, I heard what you said, Dad. And I found my father and told him we were heading out. He said he'd walk us to the car. The three of us walked out into the October evening, the golf course dark beyond the lights of the building, the air cold and clean the way it gets in Ontario, after the leaves have all come down. The parking lot was quiet. Our footsteps were loud on the asphalt. We got to our car and I unlocked it, and we stood there for a moment, not quite ready to get in. My father had his hands in the pockets of the green blazer. He was looking out at the lot. I said, Dad, I'm sorry I didn't say something at the rehearsal dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you said something tonight. I said, not soon enough. He looked at me then. He said, Lenny, you know what I've learned in 67 years? I said I didn't. He said, people like that, they already know. I said, know what? He said very simply, that they're wrong. He said it the way he says most things, without performance, without drama, the way you state something that has simply always been true. He said it, and then he was quiet again, and the three of us stood in the parking lot of Northview Golf and Country Club, and the night was cold, and there was no more to say. We drove home on the highway, the dark fields of Simcoe County passing on either side, and my father followed us in his truck as far as Barrie before he took the exit north toward home. I watched his taillights until they disappeared on the on-ramp, that cracked passenger mirror, catching the orange glow of the highway lights one more time. I didn't know it then. He told me himself, about 2 months later, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning over coffee. He told me that for the last 4 years he'd been quietly investing. Not in anything complicated. Not in anything he didn't understand. He'd sold the sheet metal shop when he retired. I knew that. I was at the dinner when he signed the papers, but I didn't know what he'd sold it for. I didn't ask because it wasn't my business. He'd sold it to a commercial firm out of North Bay that had been after him for years. And the number was not small. He'd put most of it into a financial advisor's hands at TD and told them to be boring and patient. And they had been. And the return over 9 years had been, by my father's accounting, quite satisfactory. He didn't say the number out loud. He slid a piece of paper across my kitchen table, an account summary, printed on plain white paper, the way my father does everything, without ceremony. And I looked at it, and I set down my coffee mug, and I said nothing for a while. Then I said, "Dad." He said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't you ever?" He said, "What would I have done differently?" And I thought about that. I thought about the F-150, and the electrical tape on the mirror, and the dry-cleaned blazer, and the bottle of Huntsville rye he'd brought to Oakville. I thought about him sitting at a table near the kitchen, because it would be quieter. I thought about the way he'd looked at his soup when a man in a suit called him a handyman. I thought about what it means to know your own worth so completely that you never need anyone else to confirm it. He drove back to Sudbury that afternoon. I walked him out to the truck, and before he got in, I said, "Those people, James's family, they were wrong about you." He looked at me for a moment, one hand on the door of the truck. He said, "I know that." He said it the same way he'd said the other thing, without inflection, without weight, just a fact. A settled, untroubled fact that had never required anyone's permission to be true. He got in the truck. He drove north. Some things don't need defending. Some truths sit quietly in a sheet metal shop for 32 years and come out the other side intact, without bitterness, without a need to announce themselves to anyone. My father taught me that without ever calling it a lesson. He just lived it, the way he's always lived everything, steadily and without apology, and with that particular kind of dignity that no one can hand you and no one can take away.